Hello everyone, it's Dr. Ozan Örmeci from Istanbul Kent University and International Political Economy. Today we have an important guest from United States of America, Dr. Richard Outzen. Dr. Richard Outzen served long years in the US military and rose to the rank of colonel. After his active duty, he moved on to the academic life. He holds a PhD degree in political science and he works as Middle East specialist for Atlantic Council and also some private companies. So, Richard, it's an honor to have you today. Thank you for your time.
It's good to be with you. And just for the record, the PhD is in public policy rather than political science. As those of us in public policy like to point out, if you want to study problems, you study political science. If you want to study solutions, you study public policy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the this. So, Richard, I love how Americans like to be the focus of attention. And in recent days, again, as usual, United States is on the headlines everywhere in the entire planet. But the reason wasn't that good this time. There was an assassination attempt towards the Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump and the former president, of course. So, as a person who worked long years in US security bureaucracy and who contributes to the policymaking process in Washington, D.C., what are your thoughts and observations about this assassination attempt and political polarization in the US, which is worrisome for some friends of America in Turkey?
Yeah, well, the polarization is a fact, and so too is political violence. They are not new facts with regards to the U.S. political system. If you go back with an eye to history, which Americans seldom do, being a uniquely ahistorical folk in some ways, and that has advantages and disadvantages. In some cases, we forget our own history. There were many assassination attempts and many polarized periods in American politics. I remember one of these polarizing periods that was during the Vietnam War. I was very small, but left-wing, right-wing violence in the late 60s, early 70s, and violent protests, also assassination attempts, bombings at the United States Capitol, terrorism of different stripes. You go back further, of course, during our Civil War in the 19th century and the War of 1812, there were military insurrections. Look, our history is full of polarized times, so that part's not entirely new. Uh, the political assassinations and attempted assassinations, unfortunately, have also been a fact of American life. Abraham Lincoln famously assassinated at the end of the Civil War by a Southern Democrat. Also attempts on the lives of many. It turns out, as fate would have it, that most of the assassination attempts have been against Republican presidents, and Ronald Reagan was shot unsuccessfully and attempted to kill him. Same thing now with Trump. And I'm not saying that that's the policy of the Democratic Party,
Kennedy
obviously.
was a Democrat, wasn't he?
What's that? Kennedy was a Democrat, but I think he's the only one. I think if you look at the 8 or 10 folks that have either been assassinated or been suffered an assassination attempt, it just turns out that most of them have been on the right. I think revolutionary violence is not a part of either major political party. However, there are people that believe in revolutionary violence that have been attracted a little bit further to the left wing of the spectrum than to the right wing. Again, not to say we don't have our right wing lunatics as well, like Timothy McVeigh blowing up the federal building in Oklahoma City. But I guess what I'm saying is that in a contentious society like the United States, with such a diversity of opinion and thought, and also with a culture that in some ways is more comfortable with violence in our sports, in our movies, in gun culture, and so forth, than many others, that this is unfortunately kind of part of the landscape. I think what stands out about this most recent attempt against Trump is the incompetence of the Secret Service, which has been recognized by both parties, both the Democrats and the Republicans. And as you saw earlier this week, the head of the Secret Service resigned because, in fact, there were several major failings of basic protection protocols that led to this shooting. So Trump is seen as a divisive figure, even in a very divided and polarized country. So I would not be surprised if there are further attempts. Earlier this week, there was another political death when a young left wing, a 22-year-old in one of the middle states in the United States, ran over a 70-year-old man who was planting flags for Trump. So consider that, if you will, a political killing of a pro-Trump person. I think, unfortunately, with 3 to 4 months to go before the elections, we haven't seen the end of the political violence in this cycle.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I didn't know this. It will be a very tense period, it seems. And of course, the President Biden just withdrawn from the race, and it seems like Vice President Kamala Harris will soon replace him as the Democratic Party candidate after the, of course, convention of the Democratic Party. Of course, we are not oracles, so it's too early to comment on. And United States is a very good democracy for long decades. So, but for the time being, what are your thoughts about the potential outcomes of the election and also maybe campaign in terms of polarization, Trump versus Harris, etc.?
Well, Harris as a candidate has certain advantages over Biden. So, there's reason to think that the very clear disadvantage Biden was laboring under, both in terms of polling, but also just in terms of public imaging and messaging and narrative. It looked very bad to have a man who could not speak coherently in most cases, had to be very carefully protected by his handlers from public scrutiny, and was routinely losing among demographics that are important to the Democratic chances for success. So the Democrats have removed him after a long pressure campaign. Kamala has the advantage of being a little younger. She is not known as a particularly eloquent speaker. She's not a powerful speaker like a Barack Obama. So this could be maybe a net wash, not necessarily an advantage over Biden, although she speaks uh, probably less haltingly than Biden. She's not known for delivering serious political rhetoric or arguments. So then again, in the U.S. system, oftentimes it's 3 to 5 second sound bites that matter more than the ability to give a coherent speech. So we'll see if that matters. She will appeal on the basis of being a little bit further to the left in the Democratic Party, at least in terms of her public presentation. So the progressive wing of the Democratic Party will find much to like. She skipped Netanyahu's speech in Washington to a
Yeah.
joint session of Congress yesterday.
Yes.
She's messaged on things about the environment, climate change, and so forth. Now, there's also some indications that she's actually not that progressive. It's more a matter of the messaging, because if you look at who her donors and sort of political inside support is, it's a lot of Silicon Valley businessmen. She came from California originally, so in some sense, she's maybe not quite as progressive as she seems. But that's going to draw back into the party some people who had grown cold on Biden. So I think the Democrats have an opportunity to strengthen their internal uh, consistency and their internal solidarity with regards to the vote. The initial polling, though, has not shown a real shift towards the Democrats from Trump. Trump, as a result of picking J.D. Vance, which was seen as positive, at least by the polls in the Republican constituencies, as well as some sympathy generated by, his not just surviving an assassination attempt, but really very strong response to it, getting up and shaking his fist and saying, "Fight, fight, fight." So the dynamics currently still in favor of Trump over Biden, but it's a long time. I mean, in U.S. Presidential politics and electoral politics, from July to November is an eternity. So there's a lot of things that could happen with either candidate that could shift things, or with the economy, or with external. So it's still too early to tell, to make a real prediction. But we will say, I think, safely, that compared to where Trump was versus Biden 4 years ago, that he's in a much stronger position against first Biden and now even against Kamala Harris at this stage of the campaign.
I recently interviewed some American professors like you, Richard, and they, kind of stated their anxieties and fears about Trump's presidency. Is it really, I mean, your analyses are quite objective. That's why I wanted to take your opinion. So is it worrisome for an, let's say, intellectual American having good education and serving in the US military, etc., the Trump's project and the program for the coming year? I mean, is it really that harsh, the end of democracy, etc., kind of?
Well, I mean, I guess I have a hard time taking that rhetoric seriously after hearing it for a year or two before his election in 2016, for 4 years during his presidency, and then for 4 years after his presidency. We keep hearing about the grave threat to democracy. Democracy, first of all, the United States is not a democracy in the pure sense. It's a republic, and the republic has a constitution. It has checks and balances. It has limits on presidential power. And we've seen Trump work within those. So the empirical record of saying that Trump wants to destroy democracy would have to come down to him usurping authority, refusing to turn over power when defeated, somehow disobeying the checks and balances within the system, or radically revising our standing in the world or the way we do business at home in the country. And none of those things happened. I think most of the what I would consider to be alarmist critiques of Trump come down to cheap psychoanalysis of saying he wants this, he wants that, he wants to become a dictator, he wants to end the Constitution, he wants to end abortion, he wants to do all of these things that are sort of dark fantasies of the left in the United States. But frankly, if you look at what he said, for instance, on the abortion issue, he said, I want the states to decide, and he's not in favor of a ban on abortion. It should be reflected in the 50 different states in ways appropriate to the 50 different electorates there. And that's actually a pretty middle of the road opinion in the United States. With regards to foreign policy, there's a great article just out today, July 25th, by Niall Ferguson, talking about the Trump-Vance foreign policy and describing it as very realpolitik, recognizing the limits of American power, but not walking away from alliances, not palling up with the Russians, the Chinese. These are fantasies that are cooked up, or worse than fantasies, they're conspiratorial narratives that are spun by Trump's enemies, in my opinion, in order to create this boogeyman that nobody would want to vote for. So I think if you have the ground rule at the start of any serious conversation among academics that first we have to focus on empiricals, what he did, not what you think he wants to do, or even the very unfortunate things he sometimes says, but his track record. In other words, not what he says, but what he does.
Yes.
And second of all, if you resist psychoanalysis and projection of what kind of a man you think he is, because look, I'm very jaundiced when it comes to politicians. I don't think any of them are angels. And I think people who have praised Joe Biden by saying he's less corrupt and more democratic and more publicly minded than Trump, I just don't think there's any way to judge that. So again, Trump has shot himself in the foot to some extent with how he says what he says. But if we stick to the empiricals and rule out cheap psychoanalysis, then I think what you'll see is both in the prospective program of Trump-Vance and in the past record of Trump in his first administration, there's things to criticize for sure, and there's things to oppose, especially if you're on the Democratic side of the aisle. But there's no grounds to say, oh, the house is burning. This is the end of democracy. That's just alarmism.
I agree with you. Thank you, Richard. And Richard, you worked on various topics related to Turkish-American relations and Turkish politics. You know Turkey very well. And you make generally what I observe optimistic and positive comments on Turkey. And you recently wrote a very insightful analysis, which will be published soon in our edited book with Professor Herbert Rekinbogen from American Catholic University on Turkish-American relations in 21st century. In this book, you focused on the miscommunication, misunderstanding problem between two sides. Let's hope that after the election, there'll be time to fix relations and a new blank page could be opened. In that sense, what should we expect from the new era? What strategies we could implement, since you work on these topics very closely and you're close to these decision-making centers. What are your thoughts about Turkish-American relations in the new era?
Yeah. Well, so the first thing I need to do is give a little bit of credit to the Democratic administration. As you know, I tend to lean the other way in my personal politics, but as an academic and as an analyst, I have to say that after a very slow start under the Biden administration to Turkish-American relations, with no phone calls, no contact, sort of a hands-off policy, after the Ukraine war's escalation with the Russian further invasion in February of 2022, a new sense of pragmatism and urgency infused the Biden administration's approach to Turkey, and they had some really strong efforts put forth to some extent by President Biden, but more so at the level below that. Victoria Nuland, at the State Department, worked very hard. We had an excellent, have an excellent ambassador in Jeff Flake,
Yes.
who will be, I understand, leaving in September of this year, and engaged, sustained engagement for the first time in several years to try to work through issues like Sweden and Finland accession into NATO and the F-16 deal, which was related, talking about PKK concerns, talking about support to Ukraine, and some defense industrial cooperation beyond the F-16, such as the co-production of artillery ammunition between a Turkish firm and an American firm in Texas. So these are positive forms of cooperation and close consultations that had been lacking from the relationship. So I think things have come up from a very low point, sort of in the 2017, 18, 19, and into the early years of Biden administration. So I want to give some credit there. And I think if the Democrats win, that you'll see a sustained pragmatism there, although not a high degree of trust really on either side. Now, if Trump wins, you have a different dynamic because there is a pre-existing personal relationship between Trump and Erdogan. It wasn't always an easy one, but I think they feel that they can understand one another. A lot depends on personnel. You know, there are people in the Republican Party who are more sympathetic to relations with Turkey and some that are less sympathetic. I mean, people, for instance, that are more concerned about um, the YPG in Syria and sort of protective of that for counterterrorism reasons, or more concerned about what happened with Pastor Brunson, for instance, during the previous Trump administration. The people for whom religious freedom is a very big issue and the protection of missionary efforts. Those are constituencies within the Republican Party for whom Turkey is still a thorny proposition. And then on the other hand, there's people that are, strong pro-NATO, pro-defense, and people who are sort of focused on Turkey's heft and weight as a counterbalance to Russia, to China, and to Iran. Now, there's limits to that, of course. Turkey has to get along with Iran and Russia to a certain extent, living in that neighborhood. But Turkey is also a country that is actively engaged in struggle with Iranian proxies, including the PKK, which I see as an Iranian proxy in many ways. Whatever else it may be, it has worked with the Iranian regime in a very cozy manner. And of course, in Syria, in Azerbaijan, and Libya, elsewhere, the Turks have either fought directly or by proxy against the Russians. So for the defense hawk crowd that wants the United States to be a strong alliance leader, but not to have to fight everywhere at once, Turkey has great weight and great value as a NATO ally. So my point would be that in the Trump administration, it really depends on who's in what role. And if you have people who are more geopolitically minded in the key posts, key policymaking posts, I think we'll be in a good era, or an era of lots of opportunity in the bilateral relationship. But if it's people who are a little bit more focused on, so not regional geopolitics, but on domestic issues and maybe what we might consider ideological concerns, then there's still plenty to fight about, right? There's still plenty of thorny issues between the U.S. and Turkey. I like to be an optimist, as you know, and I think there's three key things that need to be kept in mind in this bilateral relationship moving forward. Three things that are really lessons from the Cold War, during a time in which the United States and Turkey had very close and successful relations, in my view. The first key to success is to identify, publicize, and sustain joint cooperative projects. And sometimes that's working together in a country like we did in Afghanistan, for instance, or in industry, or working towards $100 billion in bilateral trade, right? These are the kind of things where both sides talk about them, both sides take steps towards them, and they create a positive environment and atmosphere and new opportunities. We need to find those things. Second is both sides need to understand, communicate, but limit to a few things, the red lines, right? Because both sides need to understand what absolutely cannot be done, and how we're stepping on one another's toes, and we need to avoid stepping on one another's toes for the most part. And then the third is, and I think Trump and Erdogan are both good at this, is to praise the relationship in public and to criticize privately, right? So now, during the first Trump administration, there were times when both sides criticized the other very loudly in public. And we don't need to go into the details of that, but I would say that leads to crisis. So when we criticize in private and praise in public, I think we maintain and protect the opportunities for cooperation, both in geopolitics and business and all those other things. I think if we stick to those three basic rules, three general rules, then I think we should have a good period ahead of us and continued recovery in bilateral ties.
Yes, and the good news is that despite what's going on in Gaza, which creates a lot of tension in Turkey, there is not a strong anti-Americanism seen in the streets or in the political scene. Of course, there are criticism in media, in academia, in among the people, but it's not that widespread as in 1960s, 70s, or early 2000 when the motion for the Iraqi war was rejected in Turkish parliament, for instance. One last question, Richard. I know you have limited time, and we have programs here in English language, and we try to follow our students like to follow American analysts. So to better understand Middle Eastern politics, including Turkey, Israel, United States, Russia, China also maybe, would you suggest some authors, scholars that we should closely follow and read their works? This is important for us because our students really make efforts to improve their knowledge.
Yeah, that's a great question. There is not a great number of people writing effectively on U.S.-Turkish relations. My friend, Dr. Soner Çağatay at the Washington Institute
Oh, yeah,
is
I
one of
know.
the most well-known in
Yeah.
Washington who writes on these things with regularity, and he has a series of books focused on President Erdogan's tenure as prime minister and president, and then sort of the ebb and flow of U.S.-Turkish relations over that time. I think that's definitely reading what Soner has written, and he writes a lot in sort of periodicals as well as his books. That would be my go-to. Uh, Honestly, the best thing to do for students is to sample a little bit of everything, be an omnivore. And with regards to Turkey and the US, that means probably keep up with what's in the Wall Street Journal. The New York Times and Washington Post tend to have things that are a little bit left of center and focus more on democratic concerns and a little bit more critical of Erdogan and of Turkey in general. The Wall Street Journal tends to be a little bit, and maybe Defense News is another one to read because they focus more on the geopolitical aspects.
Yes.
Look, Western observers spend a lot of time criticizing Turkish domestic politics, and certainly if I were a Turk living in Turkey and dealing with the economic issues and institutional issues and so forth, I'd have my own critiques based on that. I'm a foreign policy guy, so I like to focus less on, frankly, the Westerners do the same thing to Erdogan that they do to Trump, which is to psychoanalyze and to say he wants this, he wants that. I think you need to read some of that. I mean, the Western critiques of Erdogan and of Turkey, in which there's assertions that it's not a democracy, it's not an ally, it's authoritarian, all these sorts of things. Those things don't make a lot of sense in Turkey oftentimes because they're categorically stated. There's not a lot of nuance there, but it's important to understand what the West is thinking about when it's considering Turkey. So some of that, but I think also, the Wall Street Journal is probably the one that comes closest to a balanced and rooted view, and for that reason, I would recommend reading that too. So Soner Çağatay, Wall Street Journal, and sampling of everything else. That's what I would recommend to understand how the West is viewing your country.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for your time and hoping to have a talk with you after the elections for the new era in Turkish-American relations.
Okay, great, Ozan. Thanks. Good talking with you.
Bye.